Hey there, welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about aggregate supply. If you're watching this video, hopefully it means you've already watched my video on aggregate demand, because a little bit of it's going to be based on that. Starting with our axes, right? In the aggregate demand video, we talked about how the x-axis is real GDP. That's measuring output in an economy, adjusted for inflation. That's what the real part means. And the y-axis is price level, measured using some kind of index like the CPI or something like that. And we said that the y-axis, price level, is the independent variable, and the x is the dependent variable. So if the price level changes, that's going to have an impact on real GDP. Aggregate supply, as you might have been able to predict, is going to be an upward sloping line or curve, something like that. And we can go ahead and label that AS. So aggregate supply in the short run is upward sloping. There is such a thing as a long run aggregate supply curve, but it's not something that we're going to study in this video or this course. But if you hopefully take AP economics, macroeconomics that is, you would study a long run aggregate supply curve. So for now, we're going to assume all of our aggregate supply curves are occurring in the short run. So let's talk about the relationship, right? It's a positive relationship this time. What that means is the higher the price level, higher the real GDP. Lower the price level, lower the real GDP, right? It's that one goes up, the other goes up. One goes down, the other goes down type of relationship. So aggregate supply is all about looking at production, right? Since the x-axis is GDP and product, gross domestic product, is all about production, we are measuring production. Now, why does it slope upward? It all has to do with a concept called wage stickiness. By the way, this is not a term that I made up. This is like a formal economic term. So, wages, as I discussed in a video about inflation, are sticky in the short run, meaning that what people get paid for their labor isn't constantly adjusting based on the price level. For instance, I'm a teacher. I have a contract that lasts for a full year. So if I'm going to get a raise, I only get a raise once every 365 days, once a year. In that year, within that year, prices of things might be going up and up and up, right? But in the short run, while I'm fixed in my contract there, my wage is stuck at the rate that it is. And this is a central idea for why aggregate supply curves slope upward. Now, let's think about this. Let's imagine that the price level were to rise. Prices of goods rise. The going market prices for things get higher. So essentially, if you're a firm in this environment, it means that people are paying more for the product you sell, right? So that's good. That's going to increase your revenue because people will pay you more money for the thing that you make. And the other nice part of this is, as a firm, the wages you have to pay your employees are not rising with the price level, right? They're sticky, they're stuck. So you're earning more money because of the higher price level, but your costs aren't rising. Your wages are not rising in the short run here because, again, your employees are locked into contracts. So you don't have to pay them more, but you're earning more revenue, right? So what that means is that gives you an incentive as a firm. If you get more money for your product, but it doesn't cost you much more to make your product, you're going to go ahead and make more stuff. That means more profit for your firm. And so as the price level gets higher and higher and higher, firms have a signal to produce more and more and more stuff in the short run. So that's where that positive relationship comes from. It's all about wage stickiness. There is a gap between how much firms are earning in revenue and how much firms are paying in wages, their cost of production there. And that is the central idea that makes an aggregate supply curve upward sloping. There's that profit motive. When the price level goes up, firms want to produce more. When the price level goes down, firms want to produce less stuff. And that's what it's all about. Now, of course, firms have more cost than just wages, right? But for the vast majority of firms, wages are the primary thing that they have to spend money on. Yes, they're buying capital. Yes, they're buying land. But labor is the single most expensive thing for most firms. All right, so that's why it shifts upwards. Now let's talk about what can cause an aggregate supply curve to shift right or left. As we talked about in the previous slide, it's all about cost of production. So let's imagine that the cost of production increases. This is a lot like microeconomic supply, right? If everything's more expensive to make, aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. If cost of production decreases, aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? Now, why does cost of production change? We've come across this a couple of times in microeconomics when we talk about supply shifters. We talked about it there. And then also we talked about this, or you rather read about this when we learned about economic growth, right? So here are some examples. Historical, war. For instance, in 1973, the United States helped the country of Israel in a war. Now, unfortunately, what that meant was all of Israel's enemies were now enemies of the United States. And as it turned out, a lot of those countries were producers of oil and sold oil to the United States. When the United States aided one of its enemies, those countries stopped selling oil to the US. This led to a huge oil shortage. And it's not just about like, oh, okay, gas is more expensive for my car, right? Especially in the 1970s, shipping things from place to place involved, a lot of gasoline, a lot of like fuel. And so when oil became more expensive, that increased the cost of production of lots of things across the economy. This is what was called the gas crisis, gas shortage. So that's one reason. That was an aggregate supply shift to the left, what we call a negative supply shock or an adverse supply shock. On a more positive note, human capital and technology can do the opposite, right? So if there's more human capital, or knowledge and skills, or if technology makes workers more productive, that means that the cost of production decreases, right? If workers are smarter, if they have better technology, if they're more productive, then the cost of production is decreasing, and that's going to shift aggregate supply to the right. So a good example of this would be in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, personal computers were starting to really make their way into lots of different professions, right? This made work a lot easier. Workers became more productive because they had new technology like computers to get their job done. And that caused an aggregate supply shift to the right in the 1990s. And that was a very good thing. So when aggregate demand shifts to the left, it's pretty painful for the people living in an economy. It's pretty bad. When the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, it's a pretty positive thing, and we'll talk about that in another video. And these are just two reasons, right? War and changes in technology. There could be many, many, many other reasons why aggregate supply would shift to the right or shift to the left. The one thing that is a little frustrating about this is it's the one that's kind of out of the government's control. We'll talk about this when we do fiscal and monetary policies, but aggregate demand, to a degree, can be manipulated by a government. Why? Well, because it's one of the components is government spending. So if the government wants to shift aggregate demand, either way, they can just spend more or spend less. But when it comes to aggregate supply, this stuff, like war or human capital technology, is a little outside of the realm of economic policy, and it's a little harder for governments to find easy fixes for. So what we can do at this point is we can combine our two curves here onto one model. This is a very important model in the world of macroeconomics called the ADAS model, Aggregate Demand, Aggregate Supply Model. So we've looked at all of this information in the past, and this is where it all comes from. For instance, we have looked at a graph in another video of real GDP and how it's gone up and down over time. Well, real GDP is determined by the intersection, the equilibrium, of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That's where GDP comes from. The price level, as measured by, again, an index like the CPI, that comes to us over here. And so, depending on what's happening with aggregate demand or aggregate supply, real GDP might be increasing or decreasing, and the price level might be increasing or decreasing. So we're going to revisit this model many times in the future, but now we've set it up having learned about aggregate demand and having learned about aggregate supply. Thanks for watching.